I feel like AC/DC or something. It's great that Simon and Jonathan are doing this. You know, all of us who teach art history at UQ urge people to take what we teach and get out there and do things with it. And you couldn't find a more perfect example of it than this tonight, that people we've taught are making something of art history out there for people, including, I think, people who have innocently come along to eat a meal on the right-hand side here and are now going to be subjected to an art history lecture. If it's your first, this is what they're like. I'm sorry about that. But bear with us anyway. But, you know, people probably know that I'm going away to Melbourne, and, you know, it's wonderful to be able to do something for the last time. But I want to say, please continue to support this event, you know, after me. I mean, come along. It's a great thing to get art out into the community. It's great to mix drinking and art. It really is. Drinking and thinking about art. It gets easier the more you drink, actually. It's fine. I'm going to deliver two 30-minute talks. So I'll talk for about half an hour. We'll take a 15-minute break. It sounds like a lecture, you know. And then we'll come back for another half an hour. So the first one I'll be delivering is this thing called I Am, You Are, We Are Australian. Recently, one of us was watching the BBC comedy series, one of the two of our authors, entitled Rev, starring Tom Hollander, set in a small parish in Hackney, East London. The Rev, Adam Smallbone, is a liberal inner-city priest, happily married and thinking of having children. One night, after a busy day of church business, he is lying in bed with his wife Alex, both of them reading. He is reading Rowan's Rule, the biography of the Archbishop, Rowan Williamson of course, a choice that is meant to indicate his sensitivity and commitment to the job. But more tellingly for us, his wife, in this context of their wanting to start a family, is reading Christoph Zolkis's international bestseller, The Slap. Putting her book down, Alex suddenly announces to Adam, "I've decided we shouldn't have a child." Now, received in Australia as a novel about North Melbourne, seen through the eyes of the Rev, The Slap becomes a universal narrative about the challenges of modern family life. Now, this use of the slap in an international comedy series tells us something important about ourselves. Against all of our attempts to localise and nationalise its message, even if leavened with a sprinkling of multiculturalism, seen from the outside, it's shown to be coming from anywhere and speaking to everyone. Inner city Melbourne is transported to the East End of London in a way that Zolkis could not have imagined, even though he may have dreamt of it. And the joke is sealed in the Rev when, even though Reverend Adam doesn't recognise Zolkis's book, and thus why Alex is telling him this, the audience does, and laughs both at the fact that they do recognise what The Slap's about in England and at their insight into Adam's therefore unworldly character. But let us take another example of this, perhaps from the other end of the literary spectrum. The other of us, that's me in fact, was recently reading a book to one of his children, Hergé's Flight 714, originally in French called Flight 714 to Sydney. Consistent with Hergé's penchant for exotic settings, America, the Congo, here he imagines Tintin, his intrepid boy reporter, travelling to what might have been understood to be the other end of the world in order to attend a supposed astronautical conference. Of course, he doesn't quite manage to get there, with the illustrated novel ending with Tintin and Captain Haddock reboarding their plane at Jakarta after a series of alternately comedic and dramatic incidents. Here, however, in another way, Tintin, or at least the young readers of Hergé's book, were already in Australia, already imaginatively inhabiting the place he was travelling to. Or to put it the other way around, Australia, as with the Rev in England, was already in France. In some ways, indeed, the trip Hergé was imagining here for Tintin was reprising the real-world travels of Paul Gauguin, who visited Brisbane, Sydney and Auckland on the way to Tahiti in 1895. And inversely, the famous Melanesian room Gauguin erected in his studio in Paris. Now for Hergé, at least this is the joke of the book, Australia is so far away that, like a kind of magical kingdom, Tintin can never actually get there. But in fact, by the time Hergé wrote Flight 714 in 1968, that magical land had been in France for more than 150 years, at least since the time of Nicolas Baudin's 1800 to 1803 expedition, which brought back to France the fauna and flora of what was then called Nouvelle Hollande, New Holland. Indeed, between 1803 and 1814, hundreds of species of Australian plants and animals made their way back to Napoleon's wife Josephine's primary residence, the Château de Malmaison, some 12 kilometres outside of Paris. It's still there. The first kangaroo arrived in 1804, followed soon after by black swans. Acacias, melaleucas and eucalypts were planted and were thereafter introduced and made popular throughout the south of France. Indeed, on the windswept island of St Helena in the Atlantic Ocean after his defeat at Waterloo, Napoleon cultivated for the first time 2 more Antipodean specimens to remind him of Josephine, the Sydney golden wattle and the Australian everlasting daisy, both of which still thrive on the island today. Now, it should not be surprising, therefore, that the Australian tradition of landscape painting, dominated as it is by representations of the gum tree, from the Port Jackson painter through to Eugene Vangerard, the Heidelberg School and up to Fred Williams, should also be a French tradition, even a European one. We have only to think of Frenchman Henri Matisse's landscape with eucalypt trees and river from 1908, with its thickly painted deep greens and royal blues, to see him responding to the Australian landscape. But Matisse was not the only European artist to paint the gum tree, and we can even write a certain stylistic history of its depiction in 20th century European art. We would pass from the Belgian Theo van Rysselberg's neo-impressionist Eucalyptus at Saint-Tropez of 1906, which offers a view of the Mediterranean, seen through the distinctive gums set vertically in the foreground, through to the Dutchman Piet Mondrian's Cubist Eucalypts, 1912, which has the twin branches of a flowering gum rising out of a vase, through to Frenchman Paul Sinac's pointillist The Eucalypt Tree of 1913, which features a single dotted blue and yellow gum in a vertical format, and on to Italian Giacomo Balla's futurist Incandescent No. 5 Eucalyptus 1914, which employs a colour scheme of hazy blue, green and yellow, so often said to be the distinctive colours of the Australian landscape. It is indeed a tradition extended up to World War II, first by the Frenchman Raoul Dufy with his striking A Eucalyptus, 1926-27, then by the German Heine Heckroth, whose surrealistic Australia 1941 reflected his internment as an enemy alien, and finally by the German Kurt Schwitter's collage Out of the Dark 1943 with its cut-up images of Tasmanian apples. Now, what is all of this to suggest? Certainly what we see is that if there has been a long-running tradition of gumtree nationalism in this country, carried on after Federation by Hans Heissen and Arthur Streeton, there's been an almost equally long-running tradition of gumtree internationalism taking place in many countries. And we have not even begun to touch on the proud tradition in America of gumtree painting, which is also true. However, this whole history of 20th century Australian landscape painting in Europe is really an extension of the first European cartographers of Australia, who, after Plato, imagined a counterbalance to the known world in the great southern land, even though it had not yet been discovered by Europeans. My point is that these other artists are painting Australia even though they've never been there. A hypothetical continent named Terra Australis Incognita continued to change in shape, size and location, but also in style, according to the latest artistic tendencies as the European exploration of the Pacific advanced throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. And this tradition of depicting an Australia not yet seen but only imagined carried on even after Schwitter's. An unknown and unvisited Australia was to be found, for example, in New York School sculptor David Smith's breakthrough work, Australia, 1952, for Clement Greenberg and those who followed him, one of the foundational instances of abstract expressionist sculpture. Indeed, recognising its importance, it was the first piece Smith placed in the fields outside his studio at Bolton Landing, New York State, now home of the David Smith Foundation. Up to that point, his largest work, Australia traces a broadly horizontal skeletal line in space, atop which sits a floating ovoid filled with vertical strips. Often understood to be a depiction of a kangaroo, the work is as much as anything indigenous, with its X-ray quality and incisive linearity. In this regard, there are several existing speculations concerning the sources for Smith's piece. The first is that Greenberg, a close friend of Smith, passed on some images of cave paintings to him. We believe that these would have been the images of the Obiri Rock in the Northern Territory, which the Australian anthropologist Charles Mountford first brought to public attention after his Arnhem Land expedition in 1948. The second is that Smith would have seen the catalogue for the important 1941 exhibition Art of Australia, 1788 to 1941, which toured America and Canada, and whose display of works, as well as catalogue essay, written by Margaret Preston, both began and ended with Indigenous art, notably barks from the East Alligator River in the Northern Territory. Now, along the same lines, in terms of the relationship between American and Aboriginal art, we might think of the extraordinary project of the Texan painter Forrest Bess, who in the early 1950s began a remarkable self-transformation in his hometown by the Gulf of Mexico at the same time as he was exhibiting at the prestigious Betty Parsons Gallery in New York. Now, Bess was undoubtedly part of the general fascination with the, quote, primitive that marked the New York art world at the time. His work, which was said to, quote, connect threads of Jungian theory, alchemy and Aboriginal rites, included iconographic elements that are reminiscent of boomerangs, Aboriginal body painting and roundels. Bess, however, took his identification with Aboriginal body painting much further. Inspired by an article by the renegade anthropologist Wilfred D. Hamley, Australian Tribal Initiations, appearing in the June 1953 edition of the journal Sexology, Bess sought to become a hermaphrodite by creating an orifice in the base of his penis, based, he thought, on some notion of Aboriginal initiation ceremonies, so that he could be entered by another in a procedure he identified with Aboriginal initiation ceremonies. In other words, he really did try to become an Aborigine. Now, Bess today is a returned figure in American art history. His paintings, along with his extensive notes and photographs depicting his self-inflicted medical procedure from his archive, being curated by the incredibly hit New York sculptor Robert Gober into the 2012 Whitney Biennale. So people are really interested in this complete outsider artist, which is fascinating. But if from the early 1950s an American artist was turning himself into an Aborigine, from 1957 an Australian artist was turning himself into an American. The sculptor Robert Klippel moved to New York that year before taking up a position in the sculpture department of the Minneapolis School of Art between 1958 and 1962, after which he returned to New York before expatriating to Australia the following year. It was this experience that led him to invite the young New York School sculptor Richard Stankiewicz to come to Sydney, where in 1969 he made a series of 15 simplified steel sculptures, all called Australia. As with Smith, they were breakthrough works for Stankiewicz, who, like Klippel, had previously been welding together leftover foundry parts to create his assemblages. With his series Australia, however, Stankiewicz began to work much more in step with then contemporary minimalism. These Stankiewicz Australias are today to be found in museums and private collections throughout Australia and America. This is at the NGA in Australia. Standing without plinths, their welded masses and stripped back volumes in surprising balance. In Australia during this period, American sculpture was of course clearly visible, most notably in some recent American art, which toured Australia throughout 1973 and included the work of, amongst others, Dan Flavin, Eva Hess, Donald Judd, Sol LeWitt, Robert Morris, Bruce Nauman, Richard Serra and Carl Andre. In fact, Andre was some 6 years later to put on a two-person show with the Melbourne minimalist painter Robert Hunter, which toured several cities in Australia. But equally, the reciprocal tradition of Australian sculpture in America continued, perhaps at the time a little less visibly, with the work of the Maryland-based sculptor Anne Truitt, entitled Australian Spring 1972. Truitt, who could be said to represent an alternative feminine tradition of minimalism, and whose work has recently been rediscovered for this reason, in fact only toured Australia for the first time in 1981, though before coming had exchanged ideas about the country and its particular light with Greenberg. Greenberg, of course, had already been out to Australia in 1968, giving the second Power Lecture in Sydney. Truitt's Australia's Spring is a vertical rectangular column, almost like an obelisk or skyscraper, for the most part painted off-white, but with a thin blue strip running around its top, reminiscent perhaps of a lighthouse. I seem to have dressed almost in the Anne Truitt style, looking at myself. Now, we've narrated a certain American tradition of Australian sculpture, but it's a tradition that, like that of painting of the gum tree, European countries have also participated in. In 2012, some 40 years after Truitt, the Danish artist Jens Harning made another sculpture called Australia, exhibiting it at the David Pistorius Gallery here in Brisbane. Australia, 2012, was a large wall painting of the word Australia in bold sans serif type, the first two letters beginning on a purpose-built wall outside of the gallery and the remainder running on the same plane back into the gallery through a slide glass window. Now obviously Yarning's point was to bring together interior and exterior spaces, not only perhaps the spaces of art and non-art, but also Harning's native Denmark and Australia. Described in the gallery notes as, quote, a bit like an encountering a mirror, the work reminds us that we here in Australia are a productive idea not only for ourselves but also for others. So what to conclude? Looking at all of those various gum trees, what is clear is that none is alike. Each is different from the next, with arguably no commonality between them. Matisse's gum tree is different from Mondrian's, is different from Sinak's, is different from Butler's, which is only to remind us of the difference between Hyson's gum trees and Preston's and Williams's. We spoke a moment ago of a gum tree internationalism as opposed to a gum tree nationalism. But perhaps the real distinction is between a conception of the gum tree whose depiction would reveal some underlying commonality, a nationalism, and a conception of the gum tree whose various depictions would have nothing in common while all still being of gum trees, an internationalism. Let us turn now to our various Australias. They too have nothing in common with each other. And if we can construct a certain history or genealogy connecting them, a lineage of style, influence and formal development arising in a notional centre and spreading outwards, there is also no such thing. Each appearance of Australia is singular, inexplicable, unpredictable. Nothing truly does connect Smith, Bess, Stankiewicz and Truitt, let alone Harning, for all of their being American and even part of a supposed New York school and its aftermath. As with Bess and Aboriginal art, their encounter with Australia was decisive for their careers, by which we mean that, having created their Australias, their art was not the same as before, that nothing they had done previously either explains or predicts their subsequent imagining of Australia. Its appearance in their work simply marks a break in the causal or chronological unwinding of things, like a small crack in the world through which other possibilities can enter. The histories then of Australia and American art need to be denationalised. There is no single Australia, just as there is no single America. What should instead be recognised is that art happens everywhere, that Australian, even Aboriginal art is happening in Texas, just as American art has happened in Australia. Indeed, we would say that precisely to the extent that, according to provincialism, Australians can make American art, so French artists like Matisse and Sinak can make Australian art, or American artists like Smith and Bess can make Aboriginal art. In fact, we might even say that it's only by looking at Matisse's gum trees that we can begin to reimagine our own art history. Just as it is only by taking into account Smith's Australia that America might reimagine its own art history. So we write today acknowledging that we are undoubtedly at a low point in Australian art historiography. Australian art history courses are disappearing in our universities. Museums largely shun alternative stories in their big survey exhibitions and are blind to individual artists outside of the mainstream as defined by their own collections, preferring to treat the usual national tropes and figures. The narrative of 1962, when Bernard Smith published his canonical Australian painting, is still the Australia we tell the world we are. For when the Royal Academy, in partnership with the National Gallery of Australia's National Gallery of Australia's Australia appeared in 2012 in London, it was criticised both here and there for reprising Smith's exhausted nationalist story, which attempts to assert a special Australian case based on the landscape tradition. Against all of this, we are trying to write another history of Australian art. Denationalised and made metropolitan, it would take as its subject art's many divergent, incomposable Australias. An Australia, as those works we have looked at reveal, without an obvious commonality or something in common, whose story, to begin to use the philosopher's language, would have to be written not as the elaboration of an underlying essence, but as a series of family resemblances, provisional, partial attempts to engage with material that cannot all be put under one head and yet that is called the same thing. So Un-Australian Art, the name we have given our project, is not simply un-Australian, nor does it refuse to acknowledge where we are writing from and to whom we are writing, for whom we're writing. It is, as we recognise, Australian, and perhaps even more Australian than the usual Australianist histories. That is, it's more a history of our present, of how we became the Australia of today. It does not straightforwardly exclude Australian art, which has obviously existed and has a history of its own, but is something like a parallel and complementary history that doubles it, that is, repeats what is to bring out something different about it. In fact, our real point here would be that just as un-Australian history is more Australian than the usual Australian histories, so our nationalist histories were always secretly underpinned and made possible by the international. At this low point for Australian art historiography, what we have hoped to have shown is that Australia has been a source of inspiration, not only for artists here, but for artists living and working around the world. To see ourselves from the outside in, from their point of view, is to realise that Australia can still be productive for our time, is an idea that is very far from being exhausted. In one way, what we have been writing is a past history of our present. But in another way, what we seek to demonstrate is how our new thinking of our past should also change our present. Well, thank you.